Imagine stepping into a palace so grand it seems torn from a fairy tale. Gold leaf glints on every molding. Chandeliers shimmer with thousands of crystals. Tapestries stretch across walls like frozen oceans of velvet. Now, take a breath. Not the careful kind, a real, deep breath. You'd expect to inhale the soft perfume of roses or warm pastries, right? But instead, the air hits like a punch. Thick, rancid. A suffocating wave of rot, sweat, spoiled meat, mildew, and old perfume. This isn't a dungeon. This is Versailles, the glittering jewel of French royalty. And it stank. Beneath the silk and splendor of royal life in the 17th and 18th centuries lay something far more grotesque. Filth that stuck to the walls, to the gowns, to the very skin of those who ruled the world. Especially the women, queens, duchesses, princesses, who were expected to be walking portraits of perfection while silently enduring a hygiene nightmare that most modern people would flee from screaming. To understand the decay masked by diamonds, you need to know this. Bathing, the most basic ritual of cleanliness, was practically taboo. Royal women, for all their luxury, were rarely clean. And not because they didn't want to be, but because they were told it could kill them. According to the medical wisdom of the time, hot water opened the pores to disease. Steam was a threat, soap was a suspicion, and full-body bathing was viewed as an act of vanity at best, sin at worst. The church reinforced this fear, preaching that the body should be hidden, not pampered. As a result, most noble women, including queens, rarely bathed. Weeks, months, sometimes even years could pass without a real bath. Instead, they wiped their hands and faces with damp cloths. But these weren't fresh towels dipped in warm water. Often, they were soaked in vinegar, alcohol, or even urine. Yes, urine, because it was believed to draw out toxins. It didn't. It just smelled worse. When a bath did happen, it was a ritual, not a relief. And it was usually communal. A single wooden tub was filled and family members took turns, always in order of status, which meant that by the time a royal woman entered the water, she was soaking in a warm soup of sweat, skin, dirt, and the smell. It didn't just linger in the bedrooms, it bled into every hall. Visitors to Versailles often wrote of the unbearable stench that clung to the air, a haunting perfume of decaying flowers, human odor, mold, and the heavy scent of animal fats used in hair and skincare. Yet these were the same women powdered to perfection, corseted until they could barely breathe, and expected to glide through halls like ethereal beings. On the surface, beauty. Underneath, skin caked in months of grime, concealed beneath layers of fabric and fragrance. But if you thought the lack of bathing was bad, the toilet situation takes the horror to another level. Versailles, the pride of France, a palace with 2,200 rooms, had almost no toilets. There were no flush systems, no private bathrooms, no designated spaces for relief. Instead, everyone, from nobles to servants, used chamber pots, which were little more than glorified bowls. These were tucked under beds, behind curtains, or hidden inside ornate cabinets. And once they were full, someone, sometimes a servant, sometimes a lady herself, would toss the contents out the nearest window, into the gardens, onto the stone paths, into the wind. If you were unlucky enough to be walking below, you might receive a royal surprise, straight from above. It gets worse. Some courtiers didn't even bother with pots. Men were known to relieve themselves in fireplaces, stairwells, or behind tapestries. Women too, though more discreetly, often crouched behind furniture in emergency. The stench in the corridors became so unbearable that a royal edict had to be issued ordering the palace to be cleaned once a week, not once a day, not after parties, and that was considered an upgrade. For the women of the court, this created a daily dance of survival. Picture a duchess, dressed in brocade and lace, lifting her voluminous skirts not just for grace, but to avoid stepping in someone's mess. The grand marble halls they glided through doubled as open latrines. And remember, these women couldn't just hold it until they found a bathroom. There was no bathroom. Privacy was a myth. Discomfort was routine. Even wiping, something we rarely think about, was its own ordeal. Toilet paper didn't exist. Instead, scraps of cloth, bits of straw, leaves, or hands were used. And hand washing after? A luxury, not a rule. which meant infections spread like wildfire. Parasites, diseases, and stomach illnesses weren't rare. They were expected. Yet through all of this, the royal image was carefully maintained. Women were powdered, perfumed, and posed. They were held up as ideals of femininity, grace, and refinement, while their bodies itched, stank, and suffered in silence. They were trapped in a contradiction, admired like porcelain dolls, but living in a world of filth their titles couldn't protect them from. It wasn't a case of not knowing better. Observers and foreigners often commented on the state of the palaces. Some were horrified, others amused, but the royals simply continued, victims of tradition, of superstition, and of the belief that elegance had nothing to do with sanitation. And so, in the most glittering palace on earth, surrounded by chandeliers and classical music, the queens of France walked among ghosts of waste and rot. Their lives were theatre, shimmering and fragrant above the waist, and revolting just beneath the surface. If a royal woman couldn't wash her body, at the very least, she could style her hair, or so the logic went. But what began as a fashion statement quickly devolved into one of the most horrifying hygiene practices in court history. Because at Versailles and beyond, hair wasn't just hair, it was a battlefield of pride, parasites, and pain. Imagine a hairstyle so large it brushed doorframes, so elaborate it took hours, sometimes even days, to build. French court hairstyles in the 17th and 18th centuries weren't just expressions of beauty. They were architecture. Towering masses of curls, ribbons, feathers, flowers, and yes, even miniature ships were perched atop powdered wigs, forming sculptures of social power. The bigger the hair, the higher the status. But how did they achieve such heights? Not with hairspray. These gravity-defying creations were constructed with wire cages, horsehair stuffing, and cotton padding that could trap moisture, dirt, and bugs for weeks. Once the structure was secured, it was coated with pomade made from animal fat, usually beef or mutton tallow, and then dusted with flour or powder to set it. And here's where the horror crawls in, literally. That warm, greasy pomade became a buffet for lice, drawing them like a royal feast. The wigs, rarely washed or removed, became breeding grounds. Entire ecosystems flourished under the powdered curls of noblewomen. Lice burrowed into the scalp, laid eggs in the hair, and bit through the skin, all while courtiers smiled through banquets and balls. It gets worse. The itching became so unbearable that women carried silver lice claws, delicate rake-like tools designed to scratch their scalps without disturbing their hairstyles. These tools weren't hidden away. They were flaunted like accessories. Imagine sitting through a royal dinner, watching a duchess casually reach into her wig with a dainty claw and give her scalp a scratch, while discussing the latest court scandal. And yet, they endured, because to show up with a simple, clean head of hair was unthinkable. Fashion at court was currency. A well-dressed woman could rise in favor. A poorly groomed one could fall from grace. So they tolerated the itching, the stench of rancid fat, the crawling sensation of bugs under their skin, all to remain visible in a world where invisibility meant irrelevance. There were other dangers too. The wigs were so large and heavy, they often caused chronic neck pain and migraines. Some women fainted from the weight alone. Others were less lucky. On more than one occasion, the powdered wigs caught fire from nearby candles. The same animal fat that helped shape their hair was also highly flammable. Stories survive of women's wigs igniting at the dinner table, the flames consuming hair, lace, and flesh in seconds. You might wonder, why didn't they just shave their heads and wear simple wigs like men? Well, the lower classes did exactly that. Poor women, with no access to pomade or palace barbers, often shaved their heads clean to avoid lice. But for noble women, their hair, real or artificial, was considered a reflection of their femininity, fertility, and power. It was their crown, even if it masked infection and agony underneath. The obsession with appearance didn't stop at the hairline. Let's talk about what they were eating, or more importantly, what was eating them. Because while royal banquets looked heavenly, what they actually served was far from safe. In the grand halls of Versailles, meals were mountains of excess. Roasted meats, sugared fruits, glazed pastries, and oceans of wine. But hygiene in the palace kitchens was a disaster. The plumbing was so poor that raw sewage regularly backed up into the lower kitchens. Wastewater flooded floors where meats were butchered and fruits sliced. Ventilation was nearly non-existent, and refrigeration was, well, not invented. Spoiled meat was often disguised with heavy spices or sugar, not removed. Rats and flies darted between loaves of bread and wheels of cheese, and the servants, many of whom had never washed their hands, kept cooking. What did this mean for the women at court? Worms, specifically intestinal parasites, most notably tapeworms. Thanks to the undercooked meats and contaminated utensils, it wasn't uncommon for noble women to suffer bloating, cramps, diarrhea, or unexplained weight loss. Many didn't even know they were infected until the parasite made itself known. King Louis XIV himself reportedly passed a 6-inch tapeworm, a grim reminder that even the King of France couldn't escape the consequences of his kitchen. For women, meals were as much a performance as they were nourishment. They were expected to eat daintily, sip gracefully, and laugh politely, all while suppressing nausea or hiding the discomfort of a parasite twisting inside their belly. And yet, to complain was to be weak, and weakness in the royal court was fatal to reputation. Still, nothing captures the brutal absurdity of royal hygiene quite like the rituals around childbirth, which we'll explore in the next segment. But by now, it's clear. The very things that made royal women beautiful in the eyes of the world, their gowns, their wigs, their banquets, also made them sick, uncomfortable, and sometimes even maimed. They were women transformed into spectacles, their elegance layered over a festering core of poor hygiene, cultural delusion, and silent suffering. Because when you peel back the powdered layers of royal beauty, you don't find grace. You find lice, fat, worms, and fire. The cost of looking divine was living in discomfort. These women didn't just rule from golden thrones, they endured them. As if enduring crawling lice and intestinal parasites weren't enough, the final cruelty royal women faced was the one that should have been most sacred: childbirth. But in the courts of 17th and 18th century France, giving birth wasn't just a personal milestone, it was a public event, a national spectacle, and for many royal women, a moment of profound humiliation and terror dressed up in royal silk. Imagine the scene. You're a queen, your belly swollen, your body aching, and your nerves frayed from months of ceremonial observation. You're ushered not into a quiet chamber, but into a room that feels like a stage. Dozens of people, courtiers, priests, midwives, physicians, noblemen, noble women, are all packed inside, crowding the air with heat and whispers. Not to help you, not to comfort you, but to watch. Why? Because the birth of a royal baby, especially a male heir, was of such political importance that it couldn't be left to trust. Paranoia reigned. There were fears that a stillborn child or an unwanted daughter might be switched with a healthier boy. So the only way to ensure honesty was to turn the miracle of childbirth into a public theatre of flesh and blood. The Queen's privacy, her pain, her dignity, all were sacrificed to royal protocol. When Queen Marie-Thérèse went into labour, observers noted that the room was so packed it felt more like an opera than a medical ward. People jostled for space. The heat from candles and bodies turned the air into a suffocating soup, windows fogged with sweat, and at the centre of it all was a woman, bare and exposed, labouring under the gaze of dozens, many of whom wouldn't lift a finger to help. It was about witnessing, not assisting. Marie Antoinette herself famously fainted after giving birth, not just from the excruciating pain, but from the heat and pressure of having her body treated like a national viewing exhibit. The court physician wrote of the chaos, her chamber filled with curious eyes and uninvited guests, some of whom tried to reach out and touch the child even before the umbilical cord had been cut. And let's be clear, these births were incredibly dangerous. There were no painkillers, no antiseptics, no understanding of germs. Doctors and midwives often moved from one birth to another without washing their hands, unknowingly spreading deadly infections. Tools were reused, instruments were unclean, and the mother's suffering was considered part of her divine duty, not a medical crisis. Royal women died, regularly. Those who didn't often bore lifelong injuries, torn tissue, ruptured organs, prolapsed wombs. And still they were expected to rise, smile, and begin preparations for the next child, because being a royal wife wasn't about partnership or passion, it was about producing heirs. A woman's worth in the court was counted in surviving sons, and if the child didn't survive, that was another layer of pain. 1 in 3 children died before the age of 3. Many women suffered stillbirths, miscarriages, or watched their infants waste away from infections contracted during delivery. But these tragedies didn't warrant sympathy. Instead, they were treated as failures, proof that a woman's body wasn't strong enough, that her womb was weak, that her bloodline was cursed. Now imagine carrying that grief, and then being told to do it again, and again, until your body gave out. The emotional toll was unimaginable. Royal women lived with constant fear, knowing their every pregnancy could end in death, for themselves or the child. The pressure to succeed, to survive, to produce was unrelenting. There was no such thing as postpartum care, no therapy, no retreat. The show had to go on. A woman could bury a child in the morning and appear at court by evening, powdered and smiling like nothing had happened. This was the final and most brutal act of the hygiene nightmare. A woman's body as a tool of politics, her pain as a public commodity, her suffering as a national expectation. These weren't just royal women, they were vessels, and they knew it. Yet somehow, they endured. And beneath the filth, the stench, the wigs, the worms, and the public births, they found ways to reclaim their humanity. In letters, in faith, in stolen moments of solitude, in the rare bonds of sisterhood among women who knew what no man in the palace could ever understand, what it meant to suffer quietly so that others could thrive loudly. These stories aren't just curiosities from a distant time, they are a mirror, one that reflects what happens when status blinds compassion, when tradition strangles dignity, and when the most powerful women in the world have no say over their own bodies. So the next time you imagine the golden age of royalty, the powdered wigs, the glittering gowns, the ornate halls, remember the truth hiding beneath the lace. The lice, the rot, the parasites, the births performed before a crowd, the diseases no perfume could hide, and the women who carried it all, silently, stoically, tragically. This was royal life not as we dream it, but as it really was, filthy, painful, and dehumanizing. And if this dark dive into the hidden lives of royal women fascinated you, if you felt that mix of horror and heartbreak that history so often brings, then make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Grim History. Tell us which moment disturbed you most and what secret corner of the past we should expose next, because here we don't just admire the past, we dig up its dirt.